Hi, class. I am starting a new Zoom presentation, and this one is going to be on evolutionary ethics. And let us go ahead and share the screen to that lesson plan and jump right into it. And here we go. And hopefully that opened. Perfect. So this topic here may be something you may never have thought of. You may never ask yourself the question, how did human beings develop ethics in the first place? What possibly are the origins of ethics? A lot of people who come from what's more of a top-down model, which is like a supernatural explanation for our reality, might explain, well, ethics comes from some higher source, i.e. God or the goddess or what have you, and that explains ethics from a top-down model. What this approach is doing is taking it from a different angle and explaining ethics from a bottom-up explanation and kind of grounding it in more in the natural world, explaining it more connected to human beings and our relationships, our genetics and so forth. So it's grounding it in this world and explaining how out of our experience in this world develops our moral sense. So what I'm doing is I'm going to be taking this bottom-up explanation and not the top-down, because the top-down is really grounded. We need to understand that there is a top-down explanation, like a supernatural explanation that people may offer for explaining ethics, but understanding that that would be grounded more in a faith-based approach. But we're going to ground it more in the social sciences and the biological sciences and so forth to explain it a different way, maybe a way you've never thought of before. And that's part of education, is to see things from different perspectives, as we learned from the Jains, to kind of take that Anit Kantavada, that approach where we look at it from multiple angles. So in understanding evolutionary ethics, here are the notes, and we're starting off really looking at this idea, and I start here with the moral sense arises independent of kind of a divine source, and grounding it in more an explanation that's connected to natural selection. And why should we be moral? We are genetically inclined to be so. So this is an interesting take on it. It's really arguing, and it's something you probably never thought of. Instead of evolution saying it's kind of a dog-eat-dog world where it's just a world of chaos and a world of struggle and a world of, survival of the fittest, this is taking that evolutionary approach towards ethics and really understanding that instead of it being, as that was portrayed, in a negative way, it's really quite a positive understanding of human beings and our moral sense. That we are genetically hardwired to be social creatures, genetically hardwired to be kind, compassionate, caring human beings. And why are we so? And evolution can help explain that. So from an evolutionary perspective, it's kind of flipping it and taking it from the angle that morality arises from evolutionary explanation, but in a very positive direction. And so you may think, well, you're just adding on, you're layering upon ideas onto Darwin that Darwin himself didn't think, but that's not so. Darwin wrote a piece called The Descent of Man in 1871, and he discusses how humans have evolved in moral sense, and that it's evolution can help explain that. That he says here, humans are biologically inclined, this is a quote from the text, to be sympathetic, altruistic, and moral, as is proved to be an advantage in the struggle for existence. So it's not denying there isn't a struggle. Of course there is. So there's limited resources, there's what have you, the natural chaos of the world. But at the same time, the human beings that bonded together, the human beings that bonded with their mates, or pair bonding, the human beings that bonded with their families and took care of their families, the human beings that bonded with their tribe and take care of their immediate social environment, those are the human beings that we've descended from. Those are the human beings that we can call our ancestors. And so those traits to be compassionate, altruistic, and concerned for the other are ingrained inherently within our DNA, so to speak. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Yes, there are anomalies. Yes, you're going to have people with kind of an amoral sense. So certainly there are going to be arising cases but that's what you're going to expect to have. You're as a rarity, but not the norm. The norm is a general concern for your family, your loved ones, your community, and so forth. So that's kind of an interesting perspective you may not connect with Darwin, that positive view of human nature as a result of evolution. Now, there's another more modern day 21st century sociobiologist named Edward O. Wilson from Harvard. And Edward O. Wilson wrote a book called The Sociobiology. So you can call this whole area of evolutionary ethics. You can also refer to it kind of sociobiology, and explaining how we act in society can have biological explanations. So he wrote a book, and in it he looks at ethics and he biologizes it. See if I can make sense of that. He looks at our hypothalamus and our limbic system, and he says these deal with a lot of our emotions of hate and love and guilt, fear, etc. And that we need to investigate what's going on inside our brains and inside our neural net to understand our ethical approaches in the world. And that we might, we have evolved by natural selection, he says, to be moral. And it can go back to even what's going on inside the brain. So how can that work? It's arguing that the early human beings that behaved in such a way had a greater chance of survival than those that didn't. And those end up to be genetic traits that get passed on. And specifically what's being impacted are different aspects of the neural net. And in this case, he's mentioning very specifically the hypothalamus and the limbic system as playing a role in our moral behavior. So it's placing it, grounding it back into the world, grounding it back into biology. I'm not sure how comfortable you are with this, saying, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm being reduced down to biology here and how I act and behave in the world. It is not a reductionist totally approach, because it is taking into consideration that it's not what's called cheap reductionism, like we could just dismiss everything. They're saying that these are traits that we value, that we honor. We do need the altruistic and the moral and sympathetic behavior, because it allows us to live, it allows us to survive, it allows our ancestors and our children, our ancestors of the past and our children in the future to live and prosper. So these are very positive attributes of the human being. Now, the beginning of morality in primates, this whole section is looking at, well, wait a second, if we see evolution explaining ethics, can we also apply that to other species? And the answer is yes. So Frans de Waal, he is a modern day researcher in this area. He wrote a book called Primates and Philosophers. And he said we can see the roots of morality and our nearest ancestors in the primate world, and we can witness it. He doesn't necessarily say it's equal to human morality, but it's a precursor to it. So he's careful in that. He says it's a precursor, it's elements of human morality we witness, meaning that there are understanding, the primates show understandings of fairness, they understand empathy, they console each other, they try to work out problems and resolve conflicts. There's a sense of reciprocity. If you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, kind of thing. So there's definitely some elements that they have in their behavior that represents aspects of morality, and certainly kind of gives us insight into the origins of morality for us, if that makes sense. Okay, it's not saying I have to be careful. We're not saying we're better than, it's just, I don't want to, some people might get mad at me by saying I'm placing the human above the other animals of the world. I'm not trying to do that. So other people might agree with that. I'm just trying to argue that it's a precursor, it's indicator that you can look at other animals and also observe moral behavior of some sort. Now, this biologist, Mark Husser, in a book called he wrote called Moral Minds, said that there's a universal moral grammar encoded in the human neural net. And that's the whole concept of an evolutionary explanation. Now, this philosopher, biologist, Boris, he argued that there's three main instincts to account for morality. And this is kind of summarizing a lot of what I said. There's kin selection, there's mates, and there's sympathy. And so kin selection is this whole parental responsibilities, caring for your relatives that helps your genes survive. Your mates is, you know, your attachment to it's a pair bonding. Okay, so this is family bonding, this is pair bonding, which I already mentioned, and this is social bonding. So as social creatures, it was originally meant for the tribal group, the N group, but as the human race matured, so to speak, evolutionary wise, we've extended that out, that moral circle, to not just care about our immediate local group, or our tribe, but the tribe of the world, so to speak. So expanding that moral circle out to become more universal. And here's a quote from Borey's argument. The great value of this biosocial view of morality is that it removes the issues from religious and philosophical debate and places it squarely in the realm of the pragmatic. Without denying the inherently subjective nature of our goals as human beings, we may be able to agree that one reasonable goal is the maximization of happiness. The question then is, how do we educate people to understand that this is all the best interest to nurture our innate tendencies towards compassion? It's actually the last couple words I really like, that nurture our innate tendencies towards compassion. Again, the evolutionary explanation is not it's a crazy, wild, you know, animalistic world out there for the human being. It's rather we're innately hardwired to be compassionate, and it's the anomaly not to be. So that is very interesting little section right here. Now, this is an article that was assigned, and it's really a simple argument being made. So let's not like get too complicated. But we're going to be talking about in this article the difference between Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin. They're both responsible for discovering the mechanism for how evolution works, that is natural selection. Both of them are kind of given credit, although it's well known to be connected to Darwin more so. Alfred Wallace, he lost a little credibility because he got into kind of occultism and stuff in his time, but Darwin did discover it 20 years before Wallace. Wallace wrote a paper to Darwin saying, hey, look what I discovered. And Darwin already had that paper 20 years earlier, just quite nervous to publish it in the public arena for fear of retribution for people that weren't comfortable with understanding an evolutionary explanation in the 19th century. So Wallace argued for natural selection, but he argued natural selection can explain the evolution of our bodies, can explain the evolution of other creatures on this planet, but he didn't think it can explain human consciousness or human morality. That for those, he gives it a divine source. And so he's giving that top-down explanation when it comes to the human being. What Darwin does is he, yes, agrees absolutely with natural selection, but he says it also could be applied to understanding human consciousness and human morality. And he challenges Darwin there. And he gives a naturalistic explanation for morality. And so he's giving it, grounding it more in explaining, as I said, this is kind of a repeat, but grounding a moral explanation in our evolutionary background, that we have love, we have compassion, we have ability to step into the shoes of the other and feel sympathy and feel empathy, and etc., because of our evolutionary background. And in the article, it also talks about Ken Wilber, who's going to side more with Wallace, but the authors of the article kind of challenged the Wilber view and the Wallace view, and really kind of say that Darwin should not be discredited, but really understood in his own right to be offering a great insight. The very act of committing has a, let me see if I'm going to read this. This very act of committing has a survival value, particularly when pair bonding, family bonding, and tribal bonding, and so goes on, the greater resources than merely confronting the world alone. So in other words, those that have bonded with their kids, with their family, with their spouse, or mate, I should say, with the tribe, have a much greater chance of surviving than those that are doing it alone. And out of that develops a sense of connection to others, and a sense of concern for others, and a sense of moral behavior. Now, I kind of covered the main ideas. Let's hit here to the appendix here. Some students in the past have said, well, how do we account for altruism then? If it's truly like a Darwinian view, how do we account for altruism? And that is actually interesting, because Darwin says altruism can be explained by evolution. And even though you may account it to relate it back to, well, I'm acting away to carry on my DNA. You know, I have love for my children because it's really all about passing on my DNA to the world and keeping my DNA alive. And just to dismiss that my love for my children is just some evolutionary experiment is devaluing it and not really understanding it for its in and of its own trait. That out of that emerges a property called love that should be not reduced or dismissed as something of little significance. So it's really a challenge to those that just say, well, that all morality is just about carrying on your DNA and your gene pool and disregarding it, disregarding feelings of love and so forth. And that would be a mistake. It's said here that they're to be valued in and of themselves, and out of that emerges these traits that are to be valued as in and of themselves of great significance. So I hope I explained that a little bit. I don't know if I even confused you more. And moving on, these are really just other questions that students have asked in the past, so you could look at those if you'd like to. So hopefully this gave you a little introduction. Required reading, what do we have? We have small little articles like one page. This is the article on Darwin on morality. This is an article explaining Darwin's Descent of Man, and here is actually his Descent of Man. Here's the actual writings by Darwin, and I highlight in bold a lot of very important ideas if you want to read those. I make conscious effort to highlight some key ideas of where he's really explaining evolutionary ethics. And moving out of that, Darwin's moral sense here is the difference between Wallace and Darwin. There's a film explaining them as well if you want to watch that. This is DeWall's research, and he's very good on the subject. And I'm going to show you DeWall right here because it's one of my favorite films in the class. It's right here, this TED Talk. It's 15 minutes, but it's quite, say it funny because it is quite hilarious in certain sections. Jonathan does a very good job as well as a TED Talk. We have Richard Dawkins, and we have some Crash Course with Hank Green. So there's a few films to watch. These are all preliminary. I think I said, you know, I tried to lessen your film watching and your reading load a little bit. And so I said, if you watched any of these and wrote up on them, could be like pi, and pi can turn into extra credit if it's extra pi, or if it's, you know, interactive posts that you're adding really something more to the class. So some people like Bill Nye the Science Guy. Some people like this Big Kahuna one, Understanding Evolution in 4 minutes. So if you watched any of those, then you could do a great pi post on it. And if you did a few of them, it could be extra credit, is what I'm saying. Okay, and this is an extra credit, Robert Wright down here. And again, that is a little bit more time to watch. It's 15 minutes, so that would be potential extra credit as well. So the longer the film, the more effort you put in, more points you can receive on those. Okay, hopefully this gave you some insight and gave you a first-time glance at something called evolutionary ethics. There's also a whole field developing out of this called evolutionary psychology, and it's being offered at some universities, and it's the idea that we can understand human psychology by understanding our evolutionary background. So this is very similar in that vein. Okay, thank you very much. Let me stop the share. Hopefully this was not a full 30 minutes, and I will end right now. Okay, good night. Bye-bye.